And I'd like to thank Pastor Scott for this opportunity to share with you this morning. And for those of you who may not know, Pastor Scott has the privilege of marrying his daughter, Catherine, this weekend. And myself and all of our church family want to wish Catherine and Matthew a long and a blessed life together under the unity of our loving God. And the title of my message this morning is Life's Not Fair and Then You Die. And it's 5 lessons from the life of Moses. And I didn't choose this title based on the basis of current events. You know, this was one of my most repeated lines to my children as they were growing up. In fact, it is a line which will probably mark my going home celebration. And now, without disclosing any confidences, both of my children are over 30 years old. But as parents, I'm sure we've all heard this, and especially fathers, you can relate to this childhood complaint. Dad, that's not fair. And I'm sure you've heard it more than once. And it's probably comes after times says, what do you mean I can't have that latest iPhone? Or what do you mean I can't stay out till midnight on a school night? Or as they grew older, what do you mean you're not going to pay for college? And this is one that I never got because my kids knew better than to ask me this. What do you mean, as an adult, I have to pay rent to live here? And then the end would end the complaint with, that's not fair. And to which my response has been and always will be, life's not fair, and then you die. You know, well, the first few times that they heard that, they would get that pre-argumentative look on their face, on their precious little face, and they'd cock their head to the side. And you could see the brains turning, and you could think that they were probably in their minds processing, did he just say what I thought he said? And they knew better than to ask a second time, because inevitably they would just go and ask mom for what they had just asked me. But that's the fact. But you know what? I truly believe that from a human perspective, life is not fair. And I also believe that we live in a world that is corrupted by the sin of Adam and Eve, which occurred in the Garden of Eden. And this world, no matter how hard we try, will never be the perfect creation that God intended for it until Jesus Christ returns. And until then, He has left us with a written instruction book on how we are to act in the midst of these trying times. And over the past few weeks, Pastor Scott has been reminding us of some of the practical ways that we can share the love and the joy of Christ to those who may be gripped by fear at this time. And further, I don't want to make any light on any of the events of these past few weeks. And I know that people around the world have been stricken with this virus and some have died. And folks, without any intent to offend, let me clue you in on one of the major truths. The moment that we're born, we begin the dying process. And statistics prove that 100% of us will die. And it's how you live in the midst of that information that sets you apart from the herd. And I, for one, as a child of the God of the impossible, refuse to get involved in the sky is falling mentality that is being sold on the hourly basis. You know, I watched as the men and the women of science created models that projected millions of people would become infected and die. And then those models were constantly being revised downward, lowering the true statistics so that in the end you can't rationally believe anything you see or hear. And then finally, I'm told that only these men and women of science who deny the very existence of God are to be looked at as the gods to provide answers to guide us out of this guessing game. Enough. Life's not fair, and then you die. And this morning we're going to be looking at 5 unfair events from the life of Moses. And before we start, I would like to remind you that Moses was a real person. And these are true events that were recorded of his life and from his life. And I believe that God recorded these events so that we can learn something from them. They're not just there for stories, but there's something there that we can learn. And let's see what we can learn this morning from them. And as we look at each of these events, I'd like you to be aware of the following pattern. And I'm going to be repeating this pattern as we go. First, there's a serious crisis with no obvious good solution that presents itself. And then there's a choice that has to be made on how to handle this crisis. And then we see the third thing, we see that there are consequences for the choices that we make in the midst of that. And some of those consequences are good, and sometimes they're not. And then the fourth thing is life continues despite the crisis. And fifth, God has an unseen plan through all of this. And if there's one takeaway in the midst of this, if you forget the next 35 minutes or 30 minutes of message, especially for the church family, that we have to live our life in the future because the best is yet to come for us. The best is yet to come for those who believe in Jesus Christ. Now, the first event that I want to talk about is found in Exodus chapter 2, and it's the birth of Moses. Where else do we talk about the events of Moses' life than the birth of Moses? And here's the crisis. You know, at the time of his birth, the Hebrews were living as slaves in Egypt, and Pharaoh had just given the order that all Hebrew male children were to be killed at birth. That sounds like a crisis to me. And there's the choice. Moses' mother gave birth, but what do you do with the baby? And she decided to place, at 3 months old, she decided to place her son in a basket and place him in the Nile River. And what are the consequences of that choice? The baby was found by Pharaoh's daughter, not coincidentally. Moses' mother was hired as a nursemaid to raise Moses. And when Moses became old enough, he was raised as a son of Pharaoh. And life continues. And the first 40 years of Moses' life was spent in the courts of Pharaoh. And God's unseen plan for Moses, I think his unseen plan was just to preserve Moses' life, which he did in a tremendous way. And now I'd like to read from Exodus, and we begin reading at verse 2. And I'm going to be reading a lot of scripture this morning, and just follow along in the story with me. It says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. And the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took him from a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch, and she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. And now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and while her young women walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her servant woman, and she took it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. And she took pity on him and said, 'Behold, this is one of the Hebrew children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give him your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, because he said, 'I drew him out of the water.'" No coincidences there. It's a miraculous. The very mother who was feared for her son was allowed to raise him and then turn him over to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was raised in the courts of Pharaoh for the first 40 years of his life. And the second event is also found in Exodus. It's in the Exodus chapter 2, and it talks about Moses as he flees to Midian. Moses is approximately 40 years old, and he has just killed an Egyptian. And Pharaoh wants to kill Moses. And Moses has a choice. He can stay in Egypt and face the music, or he can flee and become a shepherd in the land of Midian, which he does. And the consequences were that he gives up the riches of Egypt, which was one of the most powerful nations of the earth at that time, and he becomes a shepherd and lives in a tent in the desert. And life continues, because Moses spends the next 40 years in Midian being a shepherd. And God's unseen plan for Moses, I think he was preparing Moses to lead the nation of the Hebrews out of slavery and through the wilderness and the desert wanderings. But again, let's read what the Bible has to say about that. And we begin reading around verse 11. It says, "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and he looked on their burden. And he saw the Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. And he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He committed murder. And when he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, why did you strike your companion? And he answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely this thing is known. And when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. Life's not fair. And Moses lived in Midian for the next 40 years of his life. He lived as a shepherd, as a tent dweller. He took a wife and he had children. And that's the next 40 years. Now the third event we find in Numbers chapter 20, and some time has gone by. And it also occurs after Moses has returned to the nation of Egypt. And the Hebrew nation has been let loose by Pharaoh. They've been now wandering within the desert. And Moses is in charge of them. And we see this is an instance where God miraculously provides water from the rock for the nation in the wilderness. But it's really a fundamental life's not fair moment for Moses. And the crisis occurs that no water for the people or for the livestock in the midst of this desert wilderness. And for those who may not know, there was approximately 1 million people who were on that journey. Now, some have died throughout the meantime, but others were born. It wasn't just a weekend getaway. And the choice was God instructs Moses, and he instructs Moses, and this is important to remember, in order to show God as holy. God put that in the instructions. In order to show God as holy, to speak to the rock, to bring water out for the nation. And Moses, because of some circumstances, strikes the rock. And the consequence for that was God would not allow Moses to enter the promised land. What? That's patently not fair in man's book. I hit it. But he didn't hold God as holy. And life continues for Moses because Moses lives to be 120 years old, wandering in the desert in the midst of these people, holding God as holy. And I think God's unseen plan for Moses was he was preparing Moses to live with an eye for the future. Moses could have got wrapped up with the events of the time, but I think God was preparing Moses to live with an eye for the future. And I want you to keep in mind, in the midst of this passage I'm going to read from God's Word, that Moses' sister Midian had just died. And that was a sister of Aaron and of Moses. It was probably the sister that went to Pharaoh's daughter to get him out of the Nile at the very beginning of his life. She had just passed away. And I'm sure that was weighing on Moses when the people came to complain. And listen to this complaint. And we pick up reading at verse 20. And it says, the people of Israel, the whole congregation, not just some, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. That's Moses' sister, died and was buried there. And now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, would that we have perished when our brothers perished before you? Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? Why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Any sign of mercy or compassion for Moses? It's like the people in the toilet paper line. I want what I want because I want it now. And yet Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the people and the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces before God, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron, your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring the water out of the rock from them and give them to drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. And then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly. And the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe in me to uphold me holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. And these are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy. Tragic event, and it seems patently unfair. But Moses did not hold God as holy. One of the few times that you'll find that, I think one of the only times you'll find that happening in the life of Moses. Now the fourth event is also found in Deuteronomy chapter 3, and I call it Moses' prayer request. And this one takes place on the doorstep of the promised land. And Moses is pushing 120 now. And here's the crisis. Moses is 120 years old, and he would very much like to enter the promised land. And yet he knows that God has told him, no way. And he has got a choice. Does he ask God? Does he bring a prayer request before God? But more importantly, within a choice, he can either accept God's answer, or he can get angry at God because God may say no. Moses doesn't know. And really the consequences of that, when you think about it, because we all make those bargains with God. Do you get upset with God when the vending machine God doesn't give you the candy bar that you wanted? I mean, that's not who God is. We can ask him for things, but then you exalt yourself and you humble God when you get upset with him because you don't get your way. Or is Moses going to humble himself and exalt God in the midst of this crisis? And life continues, but not much longer for Moses. He's going to be passing from this world very soon. And I think God's unseen plan is just an open display of God's holiness in the midst of this to Moses. And Moses recounts this event to the nation of Israel right before they're ready to enter into the land. And I begin reading at verse 23. And Moses says, And I pleaded with the Lord at that time. And you can hear it in his voice and his writing, saying, O Lord God, you have only begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Please let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that good hill country and Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me because of you and would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, Enough from you. Do not speak to me of this matter again. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift up your eyes westward and northward and southward and eastward, and look at it with your eyes, for you shall not go over this Jordan. But charge Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he shall go over at the head of this people, and he shall put them in possession of the land that you shall see. God says no. He emphatically says no. And if to add insult to injury, and that's not God's intent, but from a human perspective, we would think of then, he tells Moses to appoint Aaron to lead the people into the promised land. And you know, the Bible records that that's exactly what Moses did. He didn't argue. He didn't whimper. He humbled himself and exalted God. Now, the fifth event is found in Deuteronomy chapter 34, and obviously it's Moses' death. Crisis is Moses has been told by God to climb Mount Nebo and die. And the choice was Moses decides to obey God and climb Mount Nebo. I think he couldn't have. And quite frankly, my daughter and I were over in Israel this past fall, and we climbed a couple mountaintops, and thank God there was an ice cream parlor at the top of that mountaintop, because I thought I was going to die. And even though she's in her 30s, she wasn't there too much before I was. So to be 120 years old and hit the top of the mountain to get there, but know you're going to die, says something about Moses and his commitment to the Lord. And the consequences, death really is the ultimate consequences of sin. Starting in the garden, and death is an ultimate consequence from that. We're all going to face it. And life continues, and God's unseen plan, well, those are sort of cliffhangers. You're going to have to read on a little bit further in the story to find out what happens. And reading the events of Moses' death is recorded beginning at verse 34. And it says that Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, and the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, this is the land which I swore to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, and I will give it to your offsprings. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him, and he means God. God buried him in the valley of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died, and his eye was undimmed, and his vigor unabated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. And then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended, and Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there has not been a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him, for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, and to all his servants, and to all his land, for all the mighty power and for all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel. And what an epitaph that God wrote for Moses there. And what an epitaph that says. And I read through this passage in my personal Bible readings in January of this year. And I again was struck with the apparent unfairness of this. And Moses, the very man who, when God said, when the nation rebelled in the wilderness from one of the many times, but God said, I'm fed up with this nation. I'm going to destroy this nation, wipe it off the face of the earth, and I'm going to make a great nation out of you, Moses. And Moses tells God, no. He tells God, think about your name and your glory, and what would the world say? And yet God denied Moses the opportunity to take even a step into the promised land. And it would be sad if the story of Moses isn't here, but it doesn't. And for those of my generation, and I asked my wife, and she remembered this, and those who grew up listening to Paul Harvey on the radio will remember his tagline, but now the rest of the story. Well, what is there, Mike, to the rest of the story of Moses' life? Well, we need to rough fast forward some roughly 1,450 years into the future, and now we're standing in the time of Christ. We're standing in the midst of the land. And the sixth event in the life of Moses is recorded in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke. Mike, Dutch told me he died. Yeah, but this is the rest of the story. And it's called the Transfiguration, and it happened approximately 2 weeks before Jesus' death on a mountaintop near Jerusalem, and it was a meeting of Moses, Elijah, and a glorified Jesus Christ. And this event was witnessed by 3 of Jesus' closest disciples. And the crisis was Christ was weeks away from becoming God's sacrifice for mankind's sin. Really, the ultimate crisis. And Christ had a choice to make at that time. You know, he could do the Father's will, but I also think that Christ could have let sin alone and forever let it just destroy us and separate us from God. He didn't have to go to the cross. That was his choice. And the consequences from that, thank God that he did, is that we have been restored. Our relationship with God has been restored, because if he never went to the cross, that relationship would be forever broken. And life continues. As we pass from this world into the next, life's going to continue forever. And that choice is going to be a very important choice that we have. And as far as God's plan, well, we have to wait and see what God's plan is for this. And now, about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James, that's Jesus, and he took them to the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah. Not shadow figures, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, and when they became fully awake, they saw the glory of the 2 men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And not knowing what he said, he was saying these things. And a cloud came over and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. And there's a message just in that. But I just want to hit the highlight. Moses was there. God's unseen plan for the life of Moses, and truly all who believe, can be found in Jesus, and is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 9. This is really the culmination of everything. But as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man has imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. That's the story. Life's not fair. Yeah, this life's not fair because God has something greater in store for us. The future has more than we can ever imagine for those who believe in Jesus Christ. Even Moses. And where was Moses standing when this event occurred? Where was Moses standing? I know people aren't here in the room, but I'm asking that rhetorically. He was standing in the promised land. Don't you think there would have been some recording of him being excited about getting the one thing that he wanted most of all in this world? So much so that he asked God one last time to be allowed to enter the promised land? And yet, when God granted that request to Moses, what was Moses' response? Might I suggest that Moses learned the lesson that this world and that all it has to offer pales in comparison with what awaits the believers in the life that is yet to come? Moses was living in the future, folks. What he wanted most in this world really didn't mean a thing when standing in the presence of his Lord. And I'm convinced that Elijah and Moses encouraged Christ in his journey to provide salvation for all of mankind. One day I'll get to heaven and maybe get a chance to ask that. But that's the Moses story, because Moses was living in the future. And you know, in the midst of these times and in times such as this, may the same be said for all of us. And in closing, just some thoughts on the life and the faith of Moses. And if you've placed your faith in the person of Jesus Christ, live a life that focuses on the future. The best is yet to come, friends. Church, live a life that focuses on the future. And if you'd like more information on how to have this kind of faith for times such as this, please contact us on our website at fbcfarmington.org. Thank you.